President Donald Trump is eager to deliver on one of his biggest campaign promises, ending Russia's war in Ukraine. He says he'll meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday. And now we may have an idea as to the terms that could be discussed in that meeting. He told reporters yesterday it could involve a land swap. Listen.
It's very complicated, but we're going to get some back. We're going to get some switched. There'll be some swapping of territories to the betterment of both.
But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is already turning down that idea. He says he is ready to work with Trump, but says his people will not give up their land.
We are ready to work together with President Trump, together with all our partners, for a real and, most importantly, a lasting peace, a peace that will not fall apart because of Moscow's wishes.
CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh joins us now from Kyiv. Nick, is any deal that involves a trading of territories even possible here?
Yeah, I mean, it depends really what Ukraine can expect to get back from this. And it's always been a red line for President Zelensky to not cede territory to Russia without Russia forcibly occupying it. Obviously, Ukraine was invaded. And so for the thousands of Ukrainians who have died, their families, the public sentiment here, simply giving Russia land in exchange for a ceasefire, no matter how long that may last, is politically toxic as an idea, and also unwise, frankly, given that Russia has a history of violating ceasefires it's agreed to. How a land swap would even work, I struggle to think what it is that Russia currently occupies that it would be willing to give back to Ukraine. There are slivers of land north of Sumy, to the east of Kharkiv, northeast of Kharkiv, which are occupied by Russia in the border areas. Putin calling them a buffer zone. Maybe they could pull out of those areas, but they're comparatively tiny to the huge swathes of land that appear to be in Russia's sights that it wants Kiev to just give to them without a fight. That would include two towns in the Donetsk region, Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, that are close to being encircled by Russia's summer offensive. Still some way off, but they're closing the net there, certainly. And then other towns north of that, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, Dobropilya, under pressure, but also too heavily full of Ukrainian civilians at this time. So you're essentially asking Zelensky to agree to a, frankly, horrific moment for Ukraine, where tens of thousands of civilians and soldiers would have to up sticks from these towns and move out to hand them over to the Russians without a fight. Politically impalatable, frankly. So, yes, this is going to be a very complex move, if indeed the Donetsk and Luhansk regions are all that Russia actually says it wants. There may be wider demands, indeed. The maximalist position of Putin has been to demilitarize, what he calls denazify Ukraine. That's playing to a false narrative of far-right extremists being involved in the government here. And then also large areas of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions he appears to also want too. So it's important to remember that what we're seeing in Alaska on Friday is a Russian president getting a formal invitation to come to the United States, Putin's first visit in a decade, the first president of Russia to visit Alaska, bought from Russia by the United States in 1867, and indeed their terms, it seems, being discussed prior to this particular meeting. Ukraine out of the picture, and the concern, I think, being that we will now have some kind of deal hatched between Washington and Moscow that ends up being presented here to Kiev with the sort of ultimate past months of threats hanging over them.
Nick Payton-Walsh in Kyiv with that context. Thank you very much. Joining me now for analysis is CNN contributor and former CNN Moscow bureau chief Jill Doherty. Jill, good morning. Thank you for being with us. Let's start with the significance of this meeting happening on American soil. We were talking about, or at least the Russians, a specific quote from Putin was that the UAE would have been perfect. We knew Europe likely wasn't going to be a point of meeting because of the threat that Putin faces from the ICC. But were you surprised at all to know that this was happening in Alaska, American soil?
Yes, definitely. Just the mere fact that the American president is inviting the Russian president onto U.S. soil. I remember, even though the U.S. doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court, really, the United States has up to this point isolated Russia, isolated Putin. And then, I think it is a very big deal to say, welcome to Alaska. And then, as Nick mentioned, there's a lot of history here that Alaska used to be part of Russia until the United States bought it. And at this moment, there are nationalists in Russia saying, we want it back. So I think there's a lot going on. I would say there's a new wrinkle, though. The Russians now are saying that maybe because all of this is so complicated, we need a second summit. I mean, the first one hasn't even taken place. Now they're talking about another one in Moscow. And they're also talking about what I would say is kind of luring President Trump with the idea that the Arctic, of course, up near Alaska, that the Arctic is a place that could be developed and there could be all sorts of deals. So I think Putin is now pretty skillfully trying to raise that idea that, relationship back on track, we can work together, we can have deals, et cetera. It's a really an amazingly complex and fascinating moment.
Yeah, you couldn't miss the number of times that the Russian side mentioned the Arctic in their statement, clearly giving their hand here as to what negotiations will go with, what subjects they'll be bringing up. Let me ask you this. Now, Trump said that a potential peace deal would include swapping of territories between Russia and Ukraine. We've heard Zelensky say, no way, we are not giving up land. That's a whole separate question. But what would that mean if the U.S. officially recognizes territory that Russia conquered from a sovereign nation by force?
Well, it would mean that the United States is saying that it is okay to take some other country's land, invade them, take them over, and that it will be recognized legally. I mean, here's where we get into the weeds on this, because, it's one thing to conquer territory, et cetera. But for the United States to legally recognize that, now this is Russia's soil, that is a very big deal. And it really blesses the ability for a country, in theory, for a country to take over another country. And, the United States up to this point has not done that. There were areas like the Baltics that were taken over by Russia, by the Soviet Union. And the United States de facto said, yeah, that's what's happening, and we have to deal with the Soviet Union, but we don't recognize it. So these are the really complex and very important sticking points that could emerge and that are emerging.
Well, let me ask about the elephant in the room, or rather what's missing, and that's Ukraine. Trump has said he eventually wants a trilateral meeting that involves the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And we know that this idea was floated by Steve Witkoff, Trump's White House envoy, during his August 6th meeting with Putin. And he's been there 5 times already this year. But the Russians have so far shrugged off that idea. Why would Putin be so reluctant to meet Zelensky directly?
Oh, there are a number of reasons, but I think that, a couple major ones. If Putin sits down with Zelensky, it is recognizing him as the leader of another country. And Putin, number one, doesn't consider Ukraine an independent sovereign nation. And he certainly doesn't consider Zelensky a legal president. And the Russians explain that by saying, he's been in power even after he was supposed to leave power, because he has never been re-elected. Now, according to the Constitution and according to what's happening in Ukraine, they have martial law right now. So according to martial law, you can't have an election. But so the Russians are saying he's not even legitimate. And I think also it's just the desire by Putin to leave Zelensky kind of hanging there as this rogue figure, because in the future, if this goes the way Putin wants, he wants to replace Zelensky with a Russia-friendly leader. That's all part of what Putin is looking at in the not-so-distant future.
Jill Doherty, a complicated topic that you simplify for our audience. Appreciate your time as always.
Thanks, Isabel.
Thanks.